welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
This is Jessica with Syosset Library's Turn the Page podcast. My librarian co-host today is
Lisa.
And our guest today wrote a book that Lisa and I literally cannot stop talking about. Please introduce yourself and tell us about Honor.
Oh, my name is Thrity Umrigar. Honor is my ninth novel, and it tells the story of two women of Indian origin who come from very different backgrounds, class backgrounds, educational backgrounds. The first is Meena, who is this young Hindu woman who defies her brothers. She grew up in this very small, very traditional village. After her father dies, she's sort of under the care, quote unquote, of her oldest brother. And she defies him and her other brother twice, one by taking a job outside the home, which they frown upon, and next by falling in love with a coworker who happens to be Muslim, and she marries him. And for these two acts, she pays a very high price. And then Smita is an Indian-American journalist based in Brooklyn who comes to India to help out another friend who falls ill, who was the one covering Meena's case. And Smita is requested to take over. And she sort of comes back to India. We learn that she's been away for 20 years. Her family left when she was a teenager. And we get a sense that she's not at all happy to be back, but we don't know why. And the story really is about the two women, getting to know each other, but also it also sort of tells two parallel love stories. We hear from Meena directly in her own words about meeting Abdul, her future husband, falling in love with him, all of that. And then Smita's story is a little more complicated because her quote unquote romance is also with a country that she has initially vowed to never visit again. And it's all about that. It's the journey.
It certainly was a journey. And I know this is another thing Lisa and I have talked about, just like your way with words when you're talking about Meena meeting Abdul for the first time and just their whole falling in love. You fall in love with her. I mean, you know immediately that their story is very tragic and that it's heartbreaking, which I think makes the falling in love aspect of it so much more difficult.
And she tried to deny, how she felt about him for so long. By the way, I love the mangoes on the cover, and it's very symbolic.
Yes, there's a very small, but I think pivotal scene in the book that involves the mangoes, and hence I think its inclusion on the cover.
So when you how long ago did you start writing this story?
Oh, I'm always so bad with dates, but certainly a while back, few years ago. The book probably could have been published last year, but of course we were in the midst of the pandemic, and the decision, I think, in part was made because of that to hold its publication. So the book's been ready to go for a while, but I would say I probably wrote it in 2017, 2018, somewhere back there.
One of my favorite characters actually is Mohan, because he's kind of complicated,
Right.
there's something about him that I could tell why she's drawn to him and then disgusted by him at the same time. Right. I think he is my favorite in the entire thing.
He's my favorite too. So Mohan is this guy who is Smita's friend who's also a journalist and who's injured, her friend, somebody that Shannon, Smita's friend, has befriended during her posting in India. And he's this young, hip, cosmopolitan guy. But he's a person of privilege. We learned that he grew up in a wealthy family. He's well educated, so he has a lot of blind spots. So the kind of cruelties and tragedies that somebody like Meena, who has no agency of her own, has no power of her own, what she endures. Mohan, I guess, with male privilege, with urban privilege, with the privilege of class, he's sort of oblivious to these harsh realities. And so he and Smita butt heads a great deal over that, where I think there's a line in the book where she says to him, my India is not your India. And she's talking about gender differences and things like that. But I think the reason, Lisa, why you and I both like Mohan so much is he has the ability to grow and he has the ability to change. And in the end, I think that's all we can expect of anybody, is that they are willing to listen, they're willing to grow, they're willing to change. And Mohan certainly comes through in all those ways.
So I'm curious, because the story does begin as Shannon's news story, and Shannon she's not really a central character, but she's not of Indian origin, clearly, as opposed to the other main characters in the story. But it begins as a story that she was covering, and she gives it to Smita. How did that formulate? Was that always how you saw its beginning?
Yeah, I think so. I don't think that beginning changed. This is a foreign journalist, as both she and Smita are, covering a story in India. We get the sense that Shannon is sort of based in India, maybe not in Bombay, where the story, or Mumbai, as it's called today, where the story unfolds, or at least begins. But she's somebody who's familiar with South Asia. And, I think it's realistic to think that, not always, but it's likely that the person would be, since she works for an American newspaper, that she would be an American. So I didn't spend much time thinking of that. It just made sense to me that Shannon would have been the initial reporter, and it's only because she gets temporarily disabled because she has an accident that Smita would pitch in. And they are dear friends. We learned that there's a history there too. They've worked at another newspaper together, and then they've moved to this New York bigger paper together. So they're friends, and it seems logical to Shannon, who doesn't know anything about Smita's past, that she would call on her to come and pitch in for her.
No, I found it really interesting that, like, Smita says, like, how many times does she say, if she only knew that she was not going to be taking care of Shannon, she thought that she was going to be taking care of her. Like, she's almost like, I can't believe I'm actually going to be covering this story. I found that very interesting, that Shannon had no idea. So it wasn't like she was trying to deceive her. It just ended up being like that.
Right. Yeah. It was just a pure miscommunication. Shannon calls her while she's nearby India vacationing and says, hey, can you come help me out? I've had this accident. So Smita sort of connects the dots wrongly, as it turns out, and says, sure. Here's my friend who's hospitalized. I can't imagine, being in the hospital in a foreign country. Of course, I'm going to go and help. And then, it sort of unravels from that point on.
And of course, Shannon has no way of knowing why, and the reader will eventually find out why Smita is not 100% thrilled to be in India. She's got a very different experience having grown up there.
Exactly. Yeah.
I would like to give a shout out to my coworker, Neela, who's currently reading the book. And every day she's been asking me, why? why does she leave India? And I'm like, you have to keep reading. And she
Yes,
keeps
yes,
saying,
it's really quite interesting because both myself and Lisa will pass her in the break room and we'll be like, what part are you at? And she'll be like, I still don't know why. And we're just like, oh, well, we're not, you need to experience it for yourself.
yes, I said, I can't tell you. You have to keep reading and find
Yeah.
out yourself.
Good for you. No spoilers. Yeah.
No
Yeah.
spoilers.
Yeah.
So one thing I found really interesting, so Meena, in her story, she talks a lot about her brothers and, just the relationship growing up with her brother. She also has a sister who paid a different price for coaxing her to work in this factory, which brought her to marry Abdul, fall in love, which is also sad in its own way. She's was married off to somebody much, much older than her. So I think Meena says at one point she's in a prison of her own. But Meena's brothers are, aside from all of like the bigotry and, it's like they're almost under the influence of somebody who's, for lack of a better term, a cult leader. Actually, I mean, if I'm misreading that, please let me know, because Lisa and I were kind of wondering about that ourselves.
He's very charismatic.
Convinces people that he can do pretty much magic, I suppose. It was just crazy to read.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. So he's the head of the village, basically, right? And he's the most powerful man in the village, which means he's rich. He has money. And the brothers are just, they're peasants and they're trying to eke out a living from the land that is yielding less and less every single passing year. So one, they're indebted to him for those kinds of reasons. But Rupal is like, I don't know if I would call him a cult leader, but he's definitely like a charismatic leader. You know what I mean? He's a charlatan. I mean, he's somebody who, these are poor, illiterate people, many of whom have never experienced life outside their village. And he takes advantage of their ignorance, and in order to make himself out to be this powerful guy with like these supernatural powers, a pipeline or directly to God, just all that mumbo jumbo, he manages to prey on them and convince them of all that. And the truth is, I mean, yes, this is a book that's set in the Indian context, but we see this in every country and every culture where there are people who get powerful and rich and influential by convincing followers that they have some direct connection with God, that they have abilities to cure disease and illness, and there are millions of people who are susceptible to this kind of belief, and especially when you have no education, no other sources of information other than what you're getting from this guy, you can see how it's easy to believe these things,
Yeah, and I think I was also telling Lisa, because I've been reading a lot of books about the language of fanaticism lately. So that was sort of, ringing in my ear while I was reading this. But right. It is easier, I think, to prey on people who don't have as much and look towards influence or what they see as having influence as being almost divine in a way.
It also speaks to not just the culture, but it speaks to the system itself. For instance, if you are so poor that you don't have access to healthcare, right? You're not part of the healthcare system. You can't just go to a hospital or a doctor because you're feeling sick. What are you going to do? You still have to do something to heal. What are you going to do except put your faith in somebody who says, oh yeah, I can cure jaundice, or I can cure malaria or whatever by just some magic potion or some trick, right? So it's also an indictment, not of the individuals who fall prey to this, but of the larger system that doesn't provide people with enough alternatives, valid alternatives.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense.
I found interesting that also one of the brothers is an alcoholic and they use it to their advantage.
Right.
Like, here's some alcohol and let's see what happens. And he kind of like,
Yeah. This is when they want to escape, and they kind of, so they turn the tables on him a little bit. Yeah.
Another thing that I found interesting, it was always interesting to hear Mohan's views of America, as Smita was describing it to him, but to see how, in a way, Smita sort of reframed certain issues that she saw in American culture when everything was just so different in India. Like privilege is very different here than it is there.
Yeah, I think that's one of the things that they paradoxically bond over, but also clash over, right? Each one is defending their own country. And Smita very much identifies with being an American. I mean, she's come of age in America. She works there. It's her home, and Mohan, of course, feels very prickly and defensive when Smita goes to his home country and then is critical of practices and traditions there. So he almost reflexively, defends things, not anything extreme like, when it comes to Meena and what happens to her. He's genuinely, horrified by all that, which is why we like him. He's a good guy. But when it comes to just day-to-day living, the employment of domestic help, things like that, Smita is all about independence and, self-reliance and standing up for yourself and not having somebody else cook your meals for you. And he's like, are you kidding me? I mean, in a country with that much poverty, what are all those people going to do if we don't employ them, right? So it's, it's a big globe, and there are many different ways and very, very many different cultures.
I fell in love a little bit with, tragically, with Abdul's optimism about, he really didn't want Smita to convert to Islam. He very much was like, no, I will be a Muslim man married to my Hindu wife, and we will represent Hindustan together. It was just so heartbreakingly optimistic.
yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. I mean, and one is left wondering if his vision of how life could be, if the book, what direction, where does the book head in the end? Does it completely reject, his idealism and his optimism, or does it hold out some possibility that can still happen? But yeah, I mean, he's a singular character, and that's even as a citizen, as a human being, that always strikes me as those exceptions to the rule in every place, in every culture, in every time period. Where do they come from? Like, where do they get that idealism and hope and optimism when there's nothing in the world around them to support that or to give birth to that optimism? But it's just part of, there's some percentage of human beings that just have that gift, I think, and we are all the luckier for it, I think.
I really did not like Mita's mother-in-law. I'm not sure if I don't know.
I felt for her, though. I did
feel for her,
but I really felt for her.
She did lose her family and everything, but I don't know. And this is actually something Neil had asked me, and I'm not even sure. Do you think that Shannon really did promise her money, or is she just saying that because I was just wondering about that, if she was being truthful or she was just thinking maybe I can get some money out of that?
Oh, I think 100% Shannon did not promise her money. I mean, that would be a real no, and as far as the rules of journalism go. I mean, this woman saw her opportunity, she saw Mohan and Smita, people who looked like her, although it was very obvious that Smita was from elsewhere. And she just decided to milk it for all it was worth in the hopes that they would fall for it, So, no, I don't believe that Shannon promised her money.
Okay.
Yeah. Good question, though. Yeah.
And like you were saying, Lisa, I had a hard time with her too, but like I don't want to pull this card because I hate pulling it, like the as a mother card, but as a mother, I also felt for her very much. Or just in general, like just, losing a son who was obviously had such a great heart and had what she probably saw, like this foolish optimism that this would all work out.
And
but
losing her other son.
Yes, exactly. But she was
just one.
Yeah. She was so complex, but then like there's something she does towards the denouement of the book, and I don't want to say what it is, but it just, again, it kind of sort of flipped the script on her a little bit. She was just she was a crunchy character for sure. She had every reason to be that way, but just like that little thing that happens, it really was just so perfectly put in the context of the book.
Yeah, I think Ami is a very disagreeable character. And I think Meena, of all people, who is the recipient of her contempt and scorn and even, verbal abuse, Meena, of all people, defends her, right? Just for reasons that Jessica just said. I mean, Meena is the one who sort of understands why Ami is the way she is, right? The magnitude of the loss that she has suffered. But I think we also get a sense that, Ami was not breaking out the champagne when her son announced that he was about to marry a Hindu woman, so the prejudice and the sort of taboo of that inner religious marriage went both ways. It wasn't just Smita's brother, not just Meena's brothers who were against it. I'm sure Ami would have much rather preferred that he married, within his own community. So there's all of that, right? She's a complicated character, I think.
I know. So here, we know interfaith marriages, race marriages, they still have their issues, but they are, even like since I was a kid in the 80s, which was not that long ago, I believe that I've seen much more and heard much more, like you'll hear disagreement from the families, but not as much and not as widely as before. In India, has there been more of an opening of the marriage between the faiths?
I believe so. I think especially in the urban centers, it's much more permissible and common than it was, say, in the 1980s or whenever. The villages might be a different story, but even there, it depends on the state. There are states that are really, really poor. There are villages that are very isolated and poor. There are others that are more, they're closer to urban centers. So maybe they're not as, I don't know what the word is, as traditional. The taboos may not be as strict. It's a very, very large and diverse country. It really is. I mean, we always say that about the United States, but, multiply that by at least 3 times, because that's how large the population is, right? It's more than 3 times that of the US. So it's a very complicated country. I certainly, as just a little lowly writer, that to a fiction writer, don't feel like I'm any authority on sort of pontificating on exactly what's happening. But I would say, for the most part, much more permissible in the cities than in rural areas.
Yeah, no, I think when we think about well, I guess maybe that depends. That's for everybody, but we all tend to be, here thinking about our own. We're very America centric, like when we think about the differences and diversities in our own country, and less about like the fact that just because one place might seem homogeneous to us from our perspective, that's absolutely not the case.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, the one thing you have to, if you ever say the word India in a sentence, you have to think of complicated, complex, and diverse. It just goes hand in hand. Yeah, there's no one story of India, just as there's no one story about the US, I mean, just think about it. Think of New York City and think of, a place that's not as urban. Think of the differences there. It's like that.
Yeah, one thing that I thought was and Lisa and I were both talking about this, when Smita is sort of going through, in the beginning, they talk about a terrorist attack. Do you remember that, Lisa? You were saying, and like we both had to look it up to remember.
Yes, we get the bullet holes. Yes, we had to look that up.
Oh yeah. That's based on a real thing. I mean, generally when we think of a terrorist attack, we think of a single incident, like something that happens, a bomb goes off somewhere like that. This was very unusual in that, I mean, the city of Bombay was terrorized for 3 days. There were about 10 gunmen, armed with grenades and machine guns, and they spread out and really took over different parts of the city. It was a pretty big deal. And I think, a lot of people will refer to it even today as India's 9/11, because it had that kind of impact. Because Bombay is a very open and I would say easygoing kind of a city, and for something like that to happen where it was not even contained in one area, I mean, it was all very well planned and mapped out. And so the cultural trauma of that, the legacy is still there, I think.
Thank you so much for writing this book. I know it is, Lisa was the first one to alert us that it's on one of the celebrity reads lists.
Oh, well, besides it being Reese Witherspoon's pick?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Yeah. Yes. So that was cool. It was like right after I finished the book, Lisa sent out this email, and I was like, I just finished it, and it was so
great.
Good.
That's wonderful. That's great. Well, thank you, both of you, so very much. I really appreciate you taking the time to do this.
Thank you for being with us.
Thank you very much.
I do hope next time you write a book, you consider chatting with us about it.
Absolutely. Book me now.
All right. Can we quote you on that?
Absolutely. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. This was
Take care.
Have a good one. We are going to close this chapter to the page. Bye.
Have a beautiful day.
You
Take
too.
care.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.